Coward. The word landed flat and sharp in the still air of courtroom 3B, cutting through the quiet murmur like a blade drawn without warning. And for a brief second, even the ceiling fan seemed to hesitate, as if the room itself had heard something it could not take back. Judge Harold Whitmore leaned forward over the polished oak bench, his robe falling in rigid lines. His eyes fixed on the man before him with a kind of practiced authority that had never once been questioned. Not until today, not until this moment, because the man in the wheelchair did not react. Arthur Kane sat motionless, hands resting lightly on the arms of the chair, his fingers still, his posture straight despite the years that had etched themselves into his frame. His suit was simple, dark, worn at the cuffs but clean, deliberate, the kind of care that spoke without needing explanation. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow across his face, revealing lines not just of age but of memory, and his eyes, pale and steady, did not meet the judge's. Instead, they rested somewhere beyond the courtroom walls, as if the proceedings unfolding in front of him were distant, almost irrelevant. The judge exhaled sharply, mistaking silence for weakness. "I asked you a question," Whitmore pressed, his tone rising just enough to assert control. "Or is silence your defense strategy?" A faint ripple of discomfort moved through the gallery. People shifted in their seats. A clerk adjusted papers that didn't need adjusting. The prosecutor cleared his throat but said nothing, and still Arthur Kane did not respond. The stillness around him began to feel different now. Heavier, not empty but contained, like pressure building behind something unseen. The judge tapped his gavel once, a dry, hollow sound. "Let the record show the defendant refuses to answer," he said, his voice tightening. "And for the record, this court will not entertain theatrics or fabricated military stories meant to manipulate sympathy." The word fabricated lingered longer than it should have, hanging in the air like a challenge. Arthur's hand moved then, barely, just enough to adjust the edge of his sleeve, the motion slow, deliberate. Not defensive, not hurried, simply controlled. Across the room, a young assistant prosecutor, Daniel Reeves, shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the old man. Something about the silence didn't sit right with him. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't confusion, it was something else entirely, something he couldn't quite name. The judge leaned back now, folding his hands, his expression settling into something colder, more certain. Men who have served honorably don't hide behind silence. Whitmore continued, each word measured, sharpened. They stand, they speak, they account for their actions, and they certainly don't sit here pretending. A faint murmur rose again, quickly suppressed. The courtroom was beginning to fracture in small, almost invisible ways, not loud enough to stop anything, but enough to be felt. Arthur Kane finally lifted his gaze, not toward the judge, but forward, level, steady, his eyes moving across the room with quiet precision, taking in everything without lingering on anything. When he spoke, his voice was low, roughened by time, but clear. "I'm not pretending," he said. The words simple, almost understated, but they carried a weight that didn't match their volume. The judge's expression hardened, interpreting the response as resistance. "Then explain yourself," Whitmore snapped, leaning forward again, "because right now, all I see is a man refusing to cooperate with this court." Arthur's gaze remained unchanged, his breathing even, unhurried, as if time inside the courtroom moved differently for him. The ticking wall clock behind the judge marked each second with quiet insistence. And for a moment, no one spoke, not the attorneys, not the clerk, not even the spectators. The silence stretched, not awkward, not empty, but tense, like a line pulled too tight. And somewhere in that silence, something subtle shifted, something almost imperceptible. Daniel Reeves felt it before he understood it, a faint tightening in his chest, a sense that whatever was happening here was no longer confined to legal arguments or courtroom procedure. Arthur's lips parted slightly, as if considering something, then closed again. The pause. Deliberate, controlled, the kind of pause that made people lean forward without realizing it, waiting for something they couldn't yet define. Judge Whitmore misread it entirely, mistaking patience for hesitation. "If you have something to say, Mr. Kane," he said, his voice edged with impatience. Now would be the time. Arthur Kane did not rush, did not react to the pressure, did not raise his voice or change his posture. Instead, he let the silence settle once more, deeper this time, until even the faint hum of the lights seemed louder by comparison, and then, almost as an afterthought, almost too quiet to register, he spoke again, not to the judge, not to the room, but simply into the space between them. "I already have," he said, and the weight of those words did not announce itself loudly. It didn't need to. It moved through the room slowly, deliberately, like something waking up that had been dormant for a very long time. The hesitation did not last long, but it was enough to be noticed, enough to fracture the rhythm that had carried the courtroom from the beginning. Judge Whitmore recovered quickly, his posture tightening as he leaned forward once more, reclaiming control with the force of habit rather than certainty. "Then you will answer to this court," he said, his voice firm, though a faint strain now threaded through it, the kind that only revealed itself when something deeper had shifted beneath the surface. Arthur Kane did not respond to the statement directly, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, but there was something different now, something more defined, as if the space around him had narrowed, focusing attention without effort. Daniel Reeves felt it settle fully into place, the instinct that had been building now sharpening into recognition, not complete, not yet, but close enough to trigger action. His hand moved again, this time not stopping, his fingers slipping into his jacket pocket, retrieving his phone with a quiet, practiced motion, careful, controlled, unseen by most of the room. He lowered his gaze briefly, the screen illuminating faintly in the dim courtroom light. His thumb hovered for a fraction of a second before selecting a contact not listed by name but by number alone, a sequence he had never used before, one he had memorized without understanding why it might ever matter. The phone pressed lightly against his ear, his body angled just enough to shield the movement. The line rang once, then silence, not the hollow silence of disconnection, but a deliberate absence of sound, and then a voice, calm, precise, professional. "Identify," it said. No greeting, no introduction. Daniel swallowed, the words forming quickly but carefully. "This is Assistant Prosecutor Daniel Reeves. I am in courtroom 3B, Federal Building downtown. I need confirmation on a possible identification." There was a pause, brief but weighted. "Proceed," the voice replied. Daniel's eyes lifted slightly, glancing toward Arthur without turning his head fully. "Name presented is Arthur Kane," he said, keeping his tone low, controlled. "No visible rank, no official insignia, but subject referenced not answering to rank and implied prior designation." The silence on the line shifted, not longer, but deeper, as if something on the other end had changed position, recalibrated, clarified designation. The voice instructed. Daniel hesitated for the first time, the memory of the old man's words replaying with precise clarity, the cadence, the restraint, the deliberate choice not to say more than necessary. He lowered his voice further, almost to a whisper. "He has not stated it yet," Daniel admitted, "but there is a pattern in his speech, and his composure does not match civilian behavior under legal pressure." Another pause, this one sharper, more focused. "Stand by," the voice said, and the line did not disconnect. It remained open, carrying a silence that felt active rather than empty. Daniel felt a slight chill run through his spine, subtle but undeniable, the kind that came not from fear, but from recognition of something larger than the room he stood in. He lowered the phone slightly, but did not remove it from his ear. Waiting, listening. Across the courtroom, Judge Whitmore continued, unaware of the quiet escalation unfolding just feet away. "Your refusal to comply will be noted as obstruction," he stated, his tone firm. Again, though the edges no longer cut as cleanly as before, "and this court will proceed with or without your cooperation." Arthur Kane remained still, his hands resting where they had been, his breathing even, but his eyes shifted once more, not toward the judge, not toward the gallery, but slightly to the side, as if acknowledging something unseen. Daniel noticed it again, the small movement carrying meaning far beyond its size. The phone at his ear remained silent for another second. Then, the voice returned, different now, sharper, more alert. "Repeat the name," it said. Daniel did not hesitate this time. "Arthur Kane." He answered, clearly, precisely, There was no immediate reply, but the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It carried weight, urgency, something shifting rapidly beyond the confines of the courtroom. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened slightly, his pulse steady but elevated. And then the voice came back, lower now, controlled, but with a distinct change in tone. "Do not engage further," it said, each word deliberate. "Maintain position and observe." Daniel's breath caught for the briefest moment, not from confusion, but from confirmation. Whatever he had sensed was real, and it was already moving. He lowered the phone slowly, ending the call without a word, his gaze returning to Arthur Kane with a new understanding. Incomplete, but undeniable. The courtroom continued around them, unaware, the judge speaking, the clerk recording, the gallery watching. But beneath it all, something had already begun to shift, quietly, decisively, and it was no longer contained within those walls. The air inside the courtroom did not change all at once. It shifted in layers, subtle at first, like a pressure drop before a storm that only a few could feel. Daniel Reeves sat perfectly still now, his phone back in his pocket, his posture unchanged to anyone watching. But his awareness had sharpened to a single point, everything else fading into the background. The judge's voice continued, steady on the surface, though something in its rhythm had begun to falter. "This court will not tolerate ambiguity," Judge Whitmore declared, each word carefully placed, but no longer landing with the same authority. The certainty had thinned, replaced by something more brittle. Arthur Kane remained as he had been, unmoved, his presence quiet yet immovable, like something rooted far deeper than the room could contain. His eyes drifted once more, not searching, not reacting, simply observing, as though he were measuring time in a way no one else could perceive. The clock on the wall ticked forward, each second stretching slightly longer than the last. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights pressed against the silence, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the sealed windows and polished corridors, something had already begun moving toward them, unseen but inevitable. A clerk shifted papers again, the soft rustle sounding louder than it should have. A spectator cleared his throat and then seemed to regret it immediately. The room had become aware of itself, of every small movement, every sound, as if waiting for something to break the tension that had settled too deeply to ignore. Judge Whitmore adjusted his robe with a sharp motion, reclaiming his posture. "Mr. Kane," he said, his tone firm but edged now with impatience that bordered on frustration, "your silence will not alter the outcome here." Arthur did not look at him, did not acknowledge the statement in any visible way. But there was a shift, small, precise. His right hand moved slightly along the armrest of the wheelchair, his fingers brushing against the worn fabric of his sleeve. The motion almost absent-minded, yet it carried a weight that did not belong to casual movement. Daniel saw it clearly, the same instinct tightening again, sharper this time. He leaned forward just enough to catch the detail, something about the gesture, the timing, the restraint. It was not random, it was deliberate. And then Arthur spoke, not loudly, not directed at anyone in particular, but into the quiet itself. "Some things are not meant to be said out loud," he murmured, the words barely above a whisper, yet they carried across the room with unsettling clarity. The judge's expression hardened immediately, interpreting the statement as defiance. "This is not a place for riddles," Whitmore snapped, his voice rising just enough to echo faintly. "You will answer directly, or you will be held in contempt." The gavel lifted slightly, not yet striking, but poised, ready to reassert control, and still Arthur did not react to the threat. His gaze remained steady, distant, as if the word contempt belonged to a different world entirely. Daniel felt the moment tighten, the invisible line stretching further, the tension now unmistakable. The phone call echoed in his mind, the shift in the voice on the other end, the instruction, "Do not engage, maintain position, observe." It was not a suggestion, it was a directive, and it meant something was already in motion, something larger than the courtroom's authority, something that did not need permission to enter. The door at the back of the courtroom remained closed, silent, but it carried a new presence now, not physical, not yet, but anticipated, as if the space around it had begun to draw attention without reason. A faint vibration passed through the floor, so subtle it could have been imagined, yet Daniel felt it, not with certainty, but with enough awareness to make him glance briefly toward the entrance before catching himself. Returning his focus to Arthur, Judge Whitmore exhaled sharply, the sound cutting through the quiet. "Final warning," he said, his voice firm again, though the edge had dulled. "State your affiliation clearly, or this court will proceed without further delay." The words hung in the air, structured, official, final in their intent. Arthur Kane remained still for one more measured second, his breathing even, his presence unchanged, and then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his head just slightly, not toward the judge, not toward the gallery, but toward the empty space in front of him, as if addressing something unseen, and when he spoke again, the words were softer than before, almost lost beneath the hum of the lights. Yet they carried a precision that cut through everything else. "They stopped using names a long time ago," he said, his voice calm, almost reflective. "Only call signs remain." The sentence settled into the room like a key turning in a lock. Daniel felt it instantly, the recognition sharpening into certainty, incomplete but undeniable. His pulse steadied, his breathing controlled. He did not move, did not reach for his phone again. He did not need to. Whatever had been set in motion was already on its way. And for the first time since the proceedings began, Judge Whitmore did not respond immediately. The pause that followed was brief, almost imperceptible, yet it was there. A crack in the rhythm, a moment where the authority of the room hesitated, and in that hesitation, the balance shifted further, quietly, irreversibly, towards something none of them fully understood yet. The words settled deeper than anything that had come before, not because of their volume, but because of what they implied. The courtroom did not react immediately. No gasp, no visible shift, just a tightening, subtle and collective, as if every person present had sensed something without fully understanding it. Judge Whitmore leaned back slowly, his expression sharpening into something more controlled, more deliberate. The earlier impatience now replaced by a measured caution that had not been there before. "Call signs," he repeated, the term sounding almost out of place in the structured language of the court, as if it belonged to a different system entirely, one that did not follow the same rules. "This is not a military tribunal," he added, his tone steady, though the edge had dulled further. "This is a federal court of law, and whatever identifiers you may have used elsewhere hold no authority here." The statement was precise, logical, built on the framework he trusted, but it did not land the way it should have. Arthur Kane did not challenge it, did not correct it, did not even acknowledge it directly. His gaze remained forward, steady, as if the distinction between systems was irrelevant to him, as if he had long since stepped outside of those boundaries. Daniel Reeves felt the shift complete itself inside his mind, the final piece settling into place, not a full picture, but enough to understand the direction, enough to recognize the pattern. He had seen fragments of it before, in briefings, in offhand remarks from people who did not explain what they meant, in stories that were never written down, always spoken quietly, always ending before the important parts were said. And now, sitting in a courtroom that suddenly felt too small to contain what was happening, he understood why. His eyes moved toward Arthur again, studying him with a new clarity. The stillness was no longer ambiguous. It was deliberate, controlled, and far more significant than anyone else in the room realized. The judge exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers once against the bench again, the sound softer this time, almost thoughtful. "You are attempting to obscure your identity," Whitmore said, though the accusation lacked the force it once carried, "and this court will not allow that." Arthur's lips moved slightly, not quite a smile, not quite anything definable, just a subtle shift that passed as quickly as it came. And then he spoke again, his voice low, almost reflective. "Identity is not something you state," he said. "It is something that follows you." The sentence settled into the room with quiet weight, and for a moment, no one responded, not because they agreed, but because they could not immediately dismiss it. Daniel felt his pulse steady, his thoughts aligning with a clarity that replaced the earlier uncertainty. He did not reach for his phone again. He did not need confirmation anymore. Whatever system existed beyond this courtroom had already responded, and it was not waiting for permission to act. The door at the back of the room seemed different now, not physically, but in presence. as if it had become a focal point without anyone consciously deciding it should be. A few people in the gallery glanced toward it briefly, then looked away. Unaware of why their attention had shifted, the clerk adjusted her glasses, her movements slower now, more careful, as if the rhythm of the room had changed without her understanding how. Judge Whitmore leaned forward again, attempting to re-establish control through structure, through process. "This proceeding will continue," he said, his voice firm, though no longer absolute. "And your refusal to provide a clear affiliation will be noted as noncompliance." The words were familiar, procedural, but they felt disconnected from the moment, as if they belonged to a version of the room that no longer existed. Arthur Kane remained still, his hands resting exactly where they had been, his breathing even, his presence unchanged, and yet everything around him had shifted. The weight of the silence had deepened, not empty, not passive, but active, waiting. The clock on the wall ticked forward again, marking time that felt increasingly irrelevant. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on Arthur, not out of curiosity now, but out of recognition. He understood enough to know that whatever was about to happen would not come with warning. It would not be announced. It would simply arrive, and when it did, the structure of the room would not be able to contain it. Judge Whitmore opened his mouth to speak again, to continue, to push forward as he always had. But before the next word could form, there was a sound, faint, precise, not loud enough to interrupt, yet distinct enough to be noticed by those already paying attention. The soft, controlled click of a door handle turning somewhere behind them. And in that single, understated moment, the balance of the room shifted completely, from anticipation to inevitability. The sound did not echo, it did not demand attention, yet it carried through the room with a precision that cut deeper than any raised voice. The faint click of the door handle turning was followed by a pause, a fraction of a second where everything seemed to hold, as if the space itself was waiting to see what would come next. Judge Whitmore's words stopped mid-thought, not by interruption, but by instinct, his eyes shifting toward the back of the courtroom before he could stop himself. The movement small but unmistakable, and once it happened, others followed, a ripple of attention moving quietly through the gallery, heads turning just slightly, shoulders adjusting, the collective focus shifting without a single command. The door opened without force, without haste, revealing a figure that did not rush to enter, but stepped forward with a measured pace that seemed entirely disconnected from the tension inside the room. The man wore a dark uniform, precise and unadorned beyond what was necessary, every line of it deliberate, every detail in place. His presence did not announce itself loudly, yet it carried an authority that did not require explanation, the kind that settled into the room before he even fully crossed the threshold. Daniel Reeves felt it immediately, the confirmation he had been waiting for without knowing what it would look like. His posture straightened almost imperceptibly, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. The figure moved forward, each step controlled, unhurried, his gaze fixed ahead, not scanning the room, not acknowledging the shift he had already caused, as if he had stepped into environments like this countless times before and expected the same result every time. Judge Whitmore remained seated, his hand still resting near the gavel, but he did not move to strike it, did not call for order. For the first time since the proceedings began, the authority of the bench hesitated, not because it had been challenged directly, but because something had entered the room that did not fit within its structure. The clerk's pen stopped moving, hovering just above the page, the faint scratching sound that had been constant until now disappearing completely. The gallery fell into a deeper silence, not imposed, not requested, but instinctive, as if everyone present understood, on some level, that whatever was happening had moved beyond routine. The man in uniform came to a stop a few feet inside the courtroom, his posture straight, his presence steady, and only then did his eyes move, not to the judge, not to the attorneys, but directly to Arthur Kane. The connection immediate, unmistakable. And in that moment the room shifted again, not gradually this time, but all at once. Daniel felt it like a line snapping into place, the tension no longer building but resolving into something defined, something inevitable. Arthur did not react with surprise, did not turn sharply or acknowledge the arrival in any outward display. His head remained steady, his gaze forward, yet there was a subtle change, a barely perceptible shift in the set of his shoulders, as if something expected had finally arrived. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound sharper now, attempting to reclaim the space. "This is a restricted proceeding," he began, his voice firm but no longer absolute. "You will identify yourself before." The words did not finish, not because he was interrupted, but because they seemed to lose momentum as they were spoken. The man in uniform did not look at him, did not acknowledge the statement. His focus remained entirely on Arthur, as if the rest of the room existed only in the periphery. And then, with a precision that carried more weight than any declaration, he came to a full stop, his heels aligning with a quiet, deliberate finality. The movement small, controlled, yet it resonated through the room like a signal. Daniel's breath slowed, his attention narrowing further, every detail now clear, every second stretching with purpose. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, filled with meaning that had not yet been spoken, and in that silence, the balance of authority that had governed the courtroom from the beginning shifted completely, no longer held by the bench, no longer defined by procedure, but by something older, something earned, something that did not need to raise its voice to be understood. No one spoke, not because they were instructed to remain silent, but because the room itself had reached a point where words felt insufficient. The man in uniform stood perfectly still, his presence anchoring the space in a way that did not require acknowledgement, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though time had slowed around him, every eye in the courtroom drawn toward the same point, the same quiet center of gravity. Judge Whitmore shifted in his seat, the movement small but deliberate, his hand tightening slightly against the edge of the bench as he recalibrated, attempting to reassert the authority that had always defined this room. "Sir," he began again, this time choosing a different tone, one that balanced firmness with caution. "You are entering a federal proceeding without prior authorization. You will identify yourself immediately." The words were structured, controlled, but they no longer carried the unquestioned dominance they once had. They sounded measured now, as if being tested even as they were spoken. The man in uniform did not respond to the command, did not shift his stance or acknowledge the demand in any visible way. His gaze remained fixed on Arthur Kane, unwavering, precise, as if the rest of the room existed only as background. Daniel Reeves felt the significance of that detail settle fully into place. The absence of acknowledgement was not defiance, it was prioritization, and that distinction carried more weight than any verbal response could have. The silence stretched again, deeper this time, and then, with a movement so controlled it seemed almost ceremonial, the man in uniform brought his right hand up, not quickly, not sharply, but with a deliberate precision that carried decades of discipline behind it. His posture straightened even further, if that was possible, and in one fluid motion, he executed a salute, the gesture clean, exact, and unmistakable. It was not directed at the bench, not offered to the authority of the court. It was directed solely at Arthur Kane. And in that single moment, the structure of the room fractured completely. The hierarchy that had governed every interaction until now dissolved without a single word being spoken. Daniel felt it like a physical shift, the invisible lines of authority redrawn in real time. The clerk's pen slipped from her fingers, landing softly against the desk without drawing attention. The gallery remained frozen, not out of confusion, but out of recognition that something profound had just occurred, something that could not be undone or ignored. Judge Whitmore's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. The certainty that had defined him since the beginning now replaced by something more cautious, more aware. His eyes moved from the man in uniform to Arthur Kane, and for the first time, there was a question there, not spoken, but unmistakable. Arthur did not return the salute immediately. He did not react with urgency or surprise. Instead, he let the moment settle, allowed the weight of the gesture to exist fully within the space. His breathing remained even, his posture unchanged. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he lifted his hand, the movement restrained, deliberate, mirroring the precision of the gesture he had received, and returned the salute. The exchange was brief, silent, yet it carried more authority than anything that had been said in the courtroom since the proceedings began. Daniel's chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever he had sensed earlier had been far more significant than he had imagined. This was not a misunderstanding, not a procedural error. This was a collision of two systems, one built on written law, the other on something older, something earned, and in that collision, the outcome had already been decided. The man in uniform lowered his hand with the same precision he had raised it, his posture remaining rigid, composed, and only then did he speak, his voice low, controlled, carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "General Marcus Hale," he said, not as an introduction, not as a request for recognition, but as a statement of fact, and the name did not echo. It settled, heavy, final, as if it had been waiting to be spoken all along. Judge Whitmore inhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it marked a shift, the realization beginning to take form. The courtroom, once governed by clear lines and structured authority, now stood in a space where those lines had blurred completely, and no one present could pretend otherwise. The name did not need repetition. It did not require explanation. It carried its own weight the moment it was spoken, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was absolute. Judge Whitmore remained still for a fraction longer than before, his gaze fixed on General Marcus Hale, not with defiance, not even with confusion, but with the slow, unavoidable recognition that the ground beneath his authority had shifted in a way he could not control. The courtroom, built on structure and predictability, now held something outside its design, something that did not need permission to exist within it. General Hale did not move from his position. His posture remained exact, his presence steady, his attention still directed toward Arthur Kane, as if the rest of the room had already been assessed and set aside. Daniel Reeves felt the clarity settle fully now, the earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. He did not move, did not speak. He simply observed, understanding that whatever followed would not be directed by the court. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound controlled, measured, but carrying a weight it had not carried before. "General Hale," he said, the title forming carefully. "Within your system," he said, his tone even, devoid of tension, yet carrying an underlying finality that could not be mistaken. The courtroom absorbed the statement without reaction, yet the impact was immediate. Judge Whitmore's expression tightened, the framework he relied on now meeting something it could not easily categorize. "Everything functions within the law," the judge replied, his voice firmer now, though the certainty behind it had begun to thin. General Hale held his gaze for a brief moment, not challenging, not dismissing, simply acknowledging the statement for what it was, and then, with the same calm precision, he answered, "Not everything that matters was built to be written down." The sentence did not rise, did not press, yet it settled into the room with undeniable weight. Daniel felt it resonate, the truth of it not requiring validation, only recognition. The courtroom remained silent, the usual mechanisms of response absent, no objection, no clarification, only the steady presence of something that had shifted beyond the reach of procedure. Arthur Kane remained as he had been, unmoved, his role in the moment complete without needing further action, the focus no longer on proving anything, but on what had already been revealed. Judge Whitmore inhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, yet carrying the weight of recalculation. His eyes moved once more between the two men, the realization forming not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual understanding that the authority he held did not extend as far as he had always believed. And in that understanding, the room settled into a new balance, one that no longer belonged solely to the bench, but to something shared, something unspoken, something that could not be undone. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm, marking time that now felt secondary to the moment itself. And for the first time since the proceedings began, no one rushed to fill the silence, because everyone present understood, whether fully or not, that the silence itself had become the most powerful thing in the room. The silence did not break. It settled, deeper and more complete than anything that had come before. No one in the courtroom reached for words because there was nothing left that could match what had already been revealed. Judge Whitmore remained seated, his posture still upright, but the rigid certainty that had defined him at the start of the proceedings had softened into something quieter, something more aware. His hands rested on the bench, no longer gripping its edge, no longer asserting control, but simply present, as if he understood now that control was no longer his to claim. His eyes moved once more toward Arthur Kane, not with accusation, not with authority, but with a recognition that had come too late to prevent the shift. Arthur remained still, his presence unchanged, his gaze steady, as though nothing about the moment required reaction, as though everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in the spaces between words. General Marcus Hale stood where he had been, his posture exact, his presence unwavering. But there was no tension in him, no challenge. Only a quiet certainty that needed no reinforcement. The courtroom, once defined by hierarchy and procedure, now felt smaller, not diminished, but reframed, as if it had become a place where something larger had briefly stepped through and left its mark. Daniel Reeves exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a controlled release he had not realized he had been holding, his understanding complete now, not in details, not in names or records, but in the simple truth that some things existed beyond the systems built to contain them. The clerk sat motionless, her pen resting against the page without movement. The gallery remained silent, not out of confusion, but out of a shared instinct that speaking now would only diminish what had already been established. The clock continued its steady rhythm on the wall, each second passing as it always had, yet carrying a different weight, marking the return of time to its normal pace after something had interrupted it without force. Judge Whitmore shifted slightly, the movement measured, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not weakened, but recalibrated. "The court will recess," he said, the words simple, final, not driven by authority, but by acknowledgement. The gavel did not strike with force, it touched the surface lightly, a sound that marked the end of something more than just a session. General Hale inclined his head once, not toward the bench, but toward Arthur, a gesture of respect that carried no need for explanation. And then, without urgency, without ceremony, he turned, his steps as measured as when he had entered, moving toward the door with the same quiet control, the path before him opening. Without instruction, people shifting just enough to create space, not because they were told to, but because they understood. Arthur Kane remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze forward, his posture unchanged, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he adjusted his hands on the armrests, preparing to move. There was no rush, no need to match the pace of anyone else. His presence carried its own timing. Daniel watched him, not out of curiosity now, but out of respect, the kind that formed not from explanation, but from recognition. The judge did not call after him, did not attempt to reclaim the moment, because there was nothing left to reclaim. The structure had already shifted, and it would not return to what it had been before. Arthur turned his chair slightly, the movement smooth, controlled, and began to move toward the aisle, the soft sound of the wheels against the polished floor carrying through the quiet room. General Hale reached the door first, opening it, without hesitation, holding it just long enough for Arthur to pass through. Their exchange silent, precise, complete, and then they were gone. The door closing behind them with the same quiet finality as when it had opened, leaving the courtroom as it had been, and yet entirely different. The silence remained for a moment longer, not empty, but reflective, as if the room itself needed time to settle back into its boundaries. And in that silence, one truth remained, clear and unspoken: respect is not something that can be demanded within a system. It is something that exists beyond it, earned long before it is ever recognized, and remembered long after it is gone.